Ethnographic writing remains largely composition after fieldwork. It presumes and privileges at least a professional readership for its performance, just as art presumes spectators. In my view, ethnographic texts are part of a broader process of production whose earlier forms are of equal and sometimes more enduring importance than monographs or articles. While, as noted, Bishop does not mention ethnography, her work in fact revises Hal Foster's famous mid-1990s article, The Artist as Ethnographer, that clearly distinguishes site-specific and associated forms of art from ethnography, but the artist as ethnographer, question mark. A fashionable association at the time. I mean, artists for a long time have been interested in the relationship to anthropology through ethnography, but only by formally delimiting the latter as method, sometimes rigorous, less imaginative, stiffer than the site-specific art that beckons toward it. So artists in constructing ethnography have done it at the expense of ethnography, in a way. That is, at the time, in comparison to make the point and police the boundary, ethnography and its potential as form and practice suffered. For ethnography, at least in the 2000s, this characterization of the relation between art and ethnography will no longer do. The relation between participatory art, at least, and multi-sited ethnography redux deserves a new trading language. Bishop's study reopens the question in ways that ethnography has done. Here are 5 arguments and observations that she makes that resonate with the ethnographic method that focuses and sustains attention upon its middle terms that I've been emphasizing, or prototypical processes, as its primary contribution to anthropological knowledge. 1, she says, in post-studio art practices since the 1990s, labeled participatory art and conceived as projects rather than works, the artist is conceived less as an individual producer of discrete objects than as a collaborator and producer of situations. The audience, previously conceived as a viewer or beholder, is now positioned as a co-producer or participant. For Bishop, 1993 seems to be a key transition year when site-specific practice becomes more ethnographic, in my sense, key to participations and less derived from theater and performance genres as in previous years. 2, although the logical conclusion of participatory art is to foreclose a secondary audience, that is, everyone is a producer, the audience no longer exists, for these actions to be meaningful, for the stakes to be high, there needs to be ways of communicating these activities to those who succeed the participants. Subsequent experiments in the 2000s have given rise to more vivid ways of conveying such projects to secondary audiences. So the problem in this kind of participatory art of secondary audiences is very important. And you could say that in anthropology, the authoritative docking in some form of publication or something, although it would have this history of movement, would be the secondary audience. But she's facing that same problem, or she's expressing the same problem in the problem of participatory artists. You have to do field work itself to know them. So critics, curators have to do field work, otherwise they get reported as something removed from having been observed by anybody other than participant. At a certain point, art has to hand over to other institutions if social change is to be achieved. It's not enough to keep producing activist art. The same goes for projects of ethnography that hope to have public or activist result. It is an art dependent on first-hand experience and preferably over a long duration. Very few observers, says Bishop, are in a position to take such an overview of long-term participatory projects. Students and researchers are reliant on accounts provided by the artist, the curator, a handful of assistants, and if we are lucky, maybe even some of the participants. So Bishop's recurrent key issue is the lack of a secondary reception or spectatorship for participatory art, and with no obvious sense of how this will be achieved. To know itself requires fieldwork, she says. This gap is one that suggests methodological innovation and experiment, an impulse that both participatory art projects and ethnographic ones share. A contraption in either anthropology or participatory art seems to develop from a period and experience of intensive site specificity toward its dialogic sources. In terms of multi-sited ethnography, it is not so much a matter of following a path as being pulled by the polyphony in a site toward the speculative designing of related receptions elsewhere. And this requires all sorts of acts of the imagination about where an ethnography goes. Nested and scaffolded commentaries and represented thinking in carefully staged and composed venues, at least for the purposes of ethnography, do have extraordinary cumulative value. Recent interest of ethnographers who came up through the same basic technology of question asking and note taking and are now producing exemplary texts in open access platform experiments like the Fortune, recursive publics like Chris Kelty, and ethnography as commentary like Johannes Fabian, and are all exploring the kind of contraptions that projects of participatory seeking spectators seem to produce. Both ethnography and participatory art share this problem of doing something about the issue of secondary publics and incorporating them in their projects. This defines a shared logic to other sites and creating forms of reception and their documentation as micro-publics, folded into results for eventual authoritative limit or docking. And ethnography may have more obvious play or direction in this regard than participatory art projects, but the logic of the impulse to experiment is no different.